So here we are at the front. So we've got several bolts we're going to have to take loose to get this off. We've got two large mounting bolts to attach the strut to the wheel hub assembly. We've got a sway bar linkage here that hooks onto the side of the strut, so that will also have to come loose. And then we've got three nuts at the top that will have to come off as well. And this will come out as a whole assembly, spring and strut. Other things we have to worry about is a wheel speed sensor. So this cable here goes to the wheel speed sensor, loops around, so it hooks on in two places on the strut. So we should simply only have to pop these off. It's just a rubber grommet on a metal fork. Kind of makes a C shape to kind of hold it in place. So once that's loose, that's out of our way. We just need to make sure and not snag it when we come completely off. And then we also have our hydraulic brake hose here. It is a flexible hose, not a solid hose like this one up by the wheel well. So it has a kind of, once again, a U shape or C shape retainer. It's got a spring loaded to it. So to get these off, you just use a large flathead screwdriver, and you can usually walk these off. You may have to tap it with a hammer, but like I said, tap it, not beat on it. And you should be able to pop this clip off and the hose will come right out of the way. So here's that clip I was talking about. So I'm going to take a screwdriver and pry that clip as best I can. There you see it'll work either side until I can get down in here and work it some more. Be ready to catch it in case it tries to shoot off. There we go. One clip loose. That allows us to move this down, and then now the hose is out of the way and the strut can come off without pulling any of the hoses with it. The next part I'm going to take off is the sway bar linkage using a rather large ratchet. As you can see here, this is a half drive ratchet with the impact style deep socket because it does have a fairly long stud here. So we're just simply going to get on here. Now you do want to be careful because this long wrench arm could wind up going up and hitting the fender, so be careful while working around this. We don't want to tear up the car. These are going to have a decent amount of torque on them, so do be careful. Once again, this is an 18 millimeter. Now we've got that loose, I'm going to move to a 21 millimeter, and that will fit the two side bolts. You can see this one, you can't see the other ones behind the rotor, but there's two side bolts here. Let's see if I can break this one loose. Once again, you are pushing up towards the fender, so be careful. So as I got this loose, the whole bolt started turning with the nut as well. So I had to go get a 21 millimeter wrench. So I'm going to grab a hold of the nut side with that and the bolt side with the ratchet. So now I should be able to break that loose. Once again, same on the bottom nut. You have a bolt and a nut design, 21 millimeter on both sides. Once you get it loose, the whole thing turns together. And there we go. Both of these are loose. They are free to move inside here. I can actually turn the nut with my hand, but I'm going to leave these on for now until I get the upper mounts loose. That's mainly just to make sure that I don't have anything just fall. You can use a jack stand or an angled brace like I did on the back to help hold things in place as you remove these items. You do not have to worry about this one pushing down and having the spring shoot out, unlike the rears, due to the spring is actually mounted to the upper plate and then to this lower plate. So it's wedged between there. It's not going anywhere until you actually start taking the strut apart. So once we get it down, we'll show you how that all comes apart and some safety measures you want to take to make sure you don't get injured by removing this spring. It is under a substantial amount of tension, so it can shoot off if you don't do things properly and be safe. Another thing on this sway bar connector, this 18 millimeter, once again, it is like the bolt. You have a nut on the back side that you can grab a hold of that holds the ball joint from spinning so that you can actually take the nut off. Once the bolt gets loose enough, simply take it off by finger. There you go. That is loose. We just have to pop it out of place using a screwdriver or something. So there you go. There's your sway bar linkage, loose and out of the way. We're here at the top where you have 3 13 millimeter bolts. You can also see the top of the strut, the nut, just like on the back. It has a similar design, a locking nut with some bushings. Of course, this one, like I said, has the spring in between the top and bottom of it. So we can actually take these loose, because I still have the bolt in the bottom, and by taking this loose, you're not taking the spring loose, you're just taking the assembly loose. So you will not have to worry about the spring shooting out at this time. So just like the rear, sometimes there's adjustment places on cars. They can even have them up here. It depends on your car manufacturer how they decided to design it. Just like the rears, this front strut assembly, we don't have to worry about marking anything because there is no adjustments for the components we're taking loose. A telltale sign is some sort of notch markings would be on a large flanged nut like this. So this one is actually not marked, but you would have a flanged nut very similar to this with some markings. And most of the time, the flange itself is oblong, not round. That way, as you turn it, it will actually adjust, and that's how they adjust your alignment and things like that. Another fortunate thing about these not having to be marked is also we don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to be in alignment after we're done. So the car will not have to make a trip to the alignment shop to be corrected. It is simply going to be mounted back in, and everything should be just as good as it was when we took it off. So I'm actually holding the strut as I'm taking this last one loose to make sure it doesn't just fall. Now I do have it loose. I don't know if you can see that, but it will wiggle around now. Because the only thing holding it on is the bolt and nut down at the very bottom, because I've taken everything else loose. Once I take this bottom nut and bolt out, the strut will come right on out as a full assembly. I'm taking the last nut loose, bolt's still in there, it's got a little tension on it because the strut is resting on it. So now I have to take a little of that weight off that bolt. There's our bolt. So now you just have to move this around until it comes off of the wheel hub assembly. Swivel it out, not hitting the car, and then there we go. One coil spring strut assembly. Here's the new strut. This was the KYB part number 339146. That is your right front strut. The 339147 will be your left front strut. So as you see here, we do have to remove the spring, the upper plate, just like we did on the rear, and the boot. Once we do that, we get all that shifted over, we can put it right back in the car. Now, as I mentioned before, these springs are under a substantial amount of tension. They are designed to help hold the car up and only let it move just a little bit. So they are very powerful, so be very careful if you are attempting anything like this, especially your first time. They have been known to get away from people and hurt and kill people. So you want to make sure that you're getting things clamped down properly and tethering things off so that if they do break loose, they don't go shooting around the shop. Another note about the KYB is that it does have a slightly different design, just like the rears had a slightly different design from the factory rears. Looks like they did do a little bit beefier connection point here for the sway bar linkage. But other than that, that's really the main difference that I'm seeing. Everything seems to be pretty good quality here. Exactly what I expect from KYB. Now I'm putting the clamps on the spring. I've already got one on. I've got this special tool here. You can rent these or you can buy one. They're not terribly expensive. But you do want to make sure you have a good one. If you rent one, make sure that the threads and the pins are all in good shape and they're not bent and damaged. Once again, this is somewhat of a safety component here, so when you start messing with this stuff, it can cause injury. We get that over the top, we slide the pin past the actual spring, tightening down until we get this other side of the clamp over another section of the spring. So what you're wanting to do is try to get these things as far apart as possible, pretty much one on each side. I can't get it quite that far apart on this, but it should be good enough. So I'm going to get these down to hand tight. Now that I have these hand tight, they're ready to be clamped down and actually compress the springs so that we can keep the tension off of the upper plate and the lower plate, so we can take this loose, pull all this out, leave the spring on the clamps, move it to the new strut, and then reassemble it before we release any tension on the spring. Now we are also going to do a safety measure of wrapping a chain through the spring and then tying it to our heavy steel cart here. Granted, it does have enough power to probably jerk this around quite a bit, but it won't go shooting around the shop if it does happen to pop loose from the tensioners. Now we have our clamps in place, ready to start tightening down, tension up the spring so it'll take the tension off the actual strut plates. I do have a chain hooked on, hopefully you can see that. And it wraps around and hooks onto this cart. This cart is made out of some really heavy steel. It's got some weight to it, so that should help keep the spring in control if it does happen to break loose. So at this point, I'm just going to crank down, and then I'm going to crank down on the opposite one for a little bit. So you want to kind of balance how you're pulling the tension on this. So as you do this, you're going to alternate from each side, and you're going to notice after a little bit of tension removing, the spring itself eventually will get free from the actual upper and lower plates and start having some free movement. Now you do want to be careful. I've seen people tighten these down to the point that you start seeing the long, thick bolt here bend. You have at that point surpassed what that tool is capable of holding. If you start seeing a bending on that, you need to back it off immediately. So our tension, I'm checking it against the plates, trying to move the spring around. This upper plate is always going to move. That's part of a pivot point for when you turn your wheels. So don't assume you have it loose because this piece is turning. That's part of the movement of the car naturally. So I'm still a little tight. It's not quite loose. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down some more. I am starting to see a gap at the bottom. You also want to watch your clamps, make sure it doesn't look like they're shifting as you're tightening them down. If they start walking towards each other, you'll have the tension lopsided on the spring. Quite a bit of dirt and corrosion here. Just want to kind of wedge the screwdriver in there if I can, just to kind of test if it's loose. It does look like it is loose. So we got quite a bit of dirt and grime kind of holding our spring kind of tight. So now that it looks like we got plenty of tension off the plates, we should be able to go ahead and break loose the nut on the end. Now these front struts have an Allen on the top. That is a 6mm Allen port at the top of these. That will help us hold this in place while we break loose that nut on the top. Now this top nut is an 18mm and it is pretty tight. I just slid a closed-in wrench over my Allen to get a little more leverage. You can also use Allen sockets on a ratchet to get more leverage on a longer ratchet. And once you get it loose, you just slowly walk it off and watch your spring. See if it looks like it's staying in place or if it's expanding with you loosening this off. Because if it's expanding with you, you may have to put a little more tension on the spring to keep it from pushing this off. So far this one's looking good. If you can see there, I did have to crank it down a little bit more, but that right there is a good indication how easy that is to move. So we should have plenty of tension off of this, so we can continue to take this loose. I'm also looking at the top. I can see I've got my nut down to just a handful of threads left, and it is actually pulled away from the upper plate. So that means there's nothing pushing that upper plate against the nut anymore. So we are definitely loose enough that we shouldn't have to worry about tension on the spring. Now we have the top plate off. This one here was a bit tight. I had to actually tap with a hammer. Once again, ever so lightly tap with a hammer to push this pin back down out of the carrier here. So it was kind of hanging tight inside that place there, so the spindle here in the middle. So I had to get a little tap, finally got it all the way out. So like I said, I've got all the tension off the spring that I need, so I can actually take this apart. So we want to be careful not to get too rough with this. It's being held together by these clamps here. We do have a rubber plate that comes off the old strut, and we want to clean that rubber plate up before we put it on our new strut. Getting a nice chemical here and give it a good wipe down. I mentioned before on the XK videos, you've got it apart. Take time to go ahead and clean up these parts. Yes, they are going to get dirty again. They are going to get grime in there again, but it's going to take it a while to get this level of grime packed onto it again. It lines up in one way, right on top of the plate there. Front kit only came with the replacement top nut, so we are going to use this one's new nut because it is once again nylon thread locking, and it is heavy duty just like the original. So here we go. That pivot had a lot of nasty road grime on it. It looks a lot better than what it was. So that actually rests on the spring here. Pretty clean plate here. Of course, our pivot plate goes right on top of that, and this goes right on top of here. So we need to put our boot on first. And this boot here has had a bit of a rough life, but we're going to save as much of it as we can. So we've got our gasket here down in the middle. This helps with creaking and squeaking. So we're going to slide it right through the center, lining up on the spring. The spring has, where the coil ends, actually has a pocket that it will set in, which will keep the spring in place so it's not shifting around. Now at the top it does not have that, it just simply rests on the spring. Here at the bottom we're going to have to kind of push it up to get it centered. Have to slide that center pin in. There we go. You may have to push this pin up a little bit. Passes through the center of the strut. Something like that. So I had to pull this up so I can get it lined up on our hole here. Got it back on. I had to use the 6mm Allen to get into the shaft and kind of jiggle it as I pried it. Put enough tension here as I jiggled to get it to work through the cylinder here in the middle. Once I had enough threads through, I was able to run the nut on. So now I've got the plate actually mounted on. I just need to tighten this nut down a little bit, and then we can start taking the tension off of the springs. Like I said, this has a nylon locking nut. As you tighten it down, when you get to that nylon section, you will have to hold it with the Allen in the middle as you tighten it down. Okay, we can see up in here where the upper plate has now stopped at the bottom part of the threaded part of the shaft, and the center shaft is pressing directly against the plate center. So at this point I need to get the torques and tighten that down to the proper torque. So this top nut is going to be torqued down to 65 foot-pound. I'm going to have to use the little extension so I can get out and around like I need to. The original was a 18, the new nut is a 17mm. So now we're going to torque it down. This requiring such a high torque, and we're not able to do it without it trying to twist on us, so we're going to wait till it's actually on the car. At this point I am safe enough to go ahead and take the tension off the springs and go ahead and get it back on the car. And this is accessible from the top of the car. So we can do that on the car. So when you're taking this off, it's the same thing as putting it on. You want to take it off evenly. Just kind of watch your spring. Get several turns on each side. Back and forth. Eventually you will get enough tension off. Be loose. And of course you can pull the pins and back it off the rest of the way by hand. So like I said, once you get it loose enough, you can back it off by finger. May have to slide it forward to get it the rest of the way off, and there you go. This one here just has a few more turns and it'll be off as well. So we got our bolt ready to go on. And we also have another thing I want you to make note of is this little tab, this lobe here. When this goes back into the car, this tab should point out towards the fender. This should point in towards the engine. So that should get you pretty close to lined up on top. This does spin. If you push on it pretty good, it will spin because it does have that pivot there. But the main thing we're going to line up is that point underneath here. You can kind of see it where the old mark was from the dirt and grime. But we're also going to make sure that we get this bolt through this bottom hole. You may have to do what I did there and shift the wheel hub over. Alright, so now I've got that bolt lined up. I'm going to run the nut on. Finger tight for right now. Still have quite a bit of play in this. Rock the whole hub back. Line up the upper bolt. Run it through. And then finger tight on that top bolt. We're still real loose. Doesn't move a whole lot because now these two bolts are in here. That gives us a little play. We can also, at this time, swing over our sway bar linkage, get it through the hole, and we're going to run that down a little bit. We'll tighten those up here in a minute. So that's got everything kind of locked in place. This time I'm going to go ahead and hook in our wheel speed sensor cable so it doesn't get pulled or pinched. Same thing with the brake line. I'm going to get that locked into its place. I'm going to slide the clip back in. That clip goes in with the hump. If you're looking at it, you'll see it has a hump. That hump needs to point outwards towards yourself. And then you can just tap it in with a hammer, or back of the screwdriver works too. Works just fine. There we go. That's not going anywhere. So now we've got our wheel speed sensor line in place. Our brake hose is back in place. We're still loose, as you can see. And that's so that we can line up our top bolts. We'll make sure we can feel with our hand. That little tab's pointing out towards the front, or to the side. So that little tab I was pointing out earlier should be pointing to the side. And we should be able to look down in here and see that there is in fact, threaded hole right there. Probably have to lift up on it a little bit to help get it lined up. Now that we've got that one lined up, we can work on trying to get the other two lined up. You have to give it a little jiggle and a lift. Same thing there. So now I've got all those started. Recall these top ones were a 13 millimeter. I'm going to go ahead and run them down a little ways, not all the way tight. Simply trying to line these back up as close as I can to where they were originally. They do have just a little play. So I don't want to get them real tight, just enough so all I've got to do is torque them. So the sway bar linkage needs to be torqued down to 60 foot-pound. Once again, I have to hold it with a wrench so it doesn't turn on me. So we've got a wrench on the back side to hold the ball joint in place. And then we're going to torque this down to 60 foot-pound. There we go. And we do have to use a wrench to hold it. That one would not hold still, so I did have to hold it. Makes it a little harder when you have to do that. There we go. 100 foot-pound, 60 foot-pound. So we had 65 foot-pound on the center strut nut, and then we got 35 foot-pound on each one of these. So there we go. Those are 13mm bolts. So that's the driver's side done. You just got to do the passenger side. Put the wheels back on. She's ready to go. Alright, so we have everything back together. Both the front struts are on now. Everything torqued down except for the wheels. We've got them on, but they're just cinched down nice and even. But we're going to lower them down and put a proper torque of 83 foot-pound on those lug nuts. Going in a star pattern. And there you go.